Will everybody please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, everybody. Okay, we'll go ahead and start with roll call.
All right, just a few housekeeping items before we do roll call. Good morning. As a reminder, this meeting is being recorded and will be available to view on SACOG's website after the meeting. For any members of the public tuning in today and who wish to make a comment, you can notify us by selecting the raise your hand feature in Zoom or by pressing *9 if participating telephonically. All public comment will be limited to 3 minutes each, and to help with timing, I will give the speaker a 1-minute warning. Lastly, for our committee members, please remember to mute yourselves until you are ready to speak, as this will help us eliminate any background noise. And when you are ready to speak, please use the raise your hand feature or press *9 if phoning in to alert the chair. Okay, directors, when I call your name, please indicate if you are present. Director Bernasconi.
Present.
Director Burris. Absent. Director Frericks. Absent. Director Gog.
Yes. Present.
Director Lozano. Absent. Director Middleton.
Present.
Director Stollard.
Present.
Director Thomas. Absent. Vice Chair Kozlowski.
Present.
And Chair Saragosa.
Here.
All right, we have a quorum.
All right, thank you, Robert. So moving along here, we'll go to public communications. Any person wishing to address this committee on an item not on the agenda, now is the time. And do we have any public comments?
There's no public comment for this.
All right, thank you. So we will move on then to the consent calendar. Any questions on the consent calendar?
Move to approve the consent calendar.
Stallard seconds.
All right, we have first by Gog and second by Stollard. Any other questions? Seeing none, roll call, please.
Directors, please indicate your vote after I call your name. Director Bernasconi.
Yes.
Burris. Absent. Frericks. Absent. Gog.
Yes.
Lozano. Absent. Middleton.
Aye.
Stollard.
Aye.
Thomas. Absent. Vice Chair Kozlowski.
Aye.
And Chair Saragosa.
Aye.
Motion carries.
All right, thank you. So moving along, we'll go to our action item, which is item 5. And this is the public participation plan release for public comment. And Ms. Ramos has this for us this morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Rosie Ramos. I'm the project manager for the public participation plan update. I am back today to share with you the draft public participation plan that we have created since I was last here in May, with the request that you recommend to our board that this draft be released for a public comment period from June 17th to August 9th. So I will do just a quick high-level overview of what is in the draft, and then I can take any questions or comments that you might have. So as just a quick refresher on what is the public participation plan, all of the metropolitan planning organizations like SACOG are required to maintain a PPP. What that includes are outreach processes for projects and programs with a specific call out for the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, the MTPSES, which is our long range plan, and the Metropolitan Transportation Improvement Program, or the MTIP. Best put by Director Kozlowski at our last meeting, the PPP is a public outreach about a plan for public outreach. So it's a process document for our staff. I would like to also point out that this fall, the next update of the MTPSES will begin, and the board will receive many staff reports on the various related components of the MTPSES, and the public participation plan is being updated now, as it will be used as a reference point for the development of the outreach for the MTPSES that will likely occur in the fall of 2022. So the PPP helps SACOG staff understand the minimum requirements for public communications and outreach for the MTPSES, the MTIP, and it also includes our overall work program as well. but it also provides documentation for the public to see where and how they can plug into the work that SACOG does. So in the current draft that you have before you in the packet, we focus on giving readers a background on what SACOG is and what we do, along with the various committees that we have, and provide a background on why we have a public participation plan. Something new that we added this year is 3 guiding principles for our outreach processes, which the first is that we are committed to an accessible and transparent engagement process. Second is that we value the voices of historically underrepresented groups, including Black, Indigenous, people of color, or BIPOC, low-income residents, the LGBTQ+ community, persons with disabilities, persons with English as a second language, and youth. And we shall make specific efforts to involve them in SACOG processes. And then the third guiding principle is that effective participation requires unique processes to engage residents and to achieve our desired outcomes. So there is no one-size-fits-all approach. And then throughout the document, we also include an explanation of the federal and state requirements that SACOG has. I won't name them all, they are listed, but happy to go over them if you'd like me to. And then we have also included a guide for staff in developing a public participation process with various strategies, including best practices for reaching our Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and then our low-income residents as well. So I'll pause there. That's a pretty high level overview, but happy to take any questions or elaborate on any of the specific details.
Thank you, Rosie. Any questions for Ms. Ramos at this point? Comments?
And then just some logistics for what's to come. So we are required to release the draft for a 45-day public comment period. Again, that starts on June 17th with your recommendation. So the ask is that we take this to the board on the 17th. And upon the board's approval as well, then we would open it for those 45 days that would end on August 9th. And during this time, we will work with our partners and stakeholders, our member jurisdictions, and other interested parties to gather input and feedback on the draft. And then once the public comment period closes, we'll incorporate the changes, respond to the comments, and finalize the draft final document, and then take it through a legal review process as well. So the final draft will come back to this committee in October, along with the request that this committee recommends the adoption of the new PPP at the October 21st board meeting. And that's the timeline that we have. So this is the second or the third time that I'll be here, one more time in October, and then I will bring that final document to you all for recommendation to our board. So happy to take any other questions.
Thank you, Rosie. Any questions? James, anything you want to add?
No, I appreciate obviously the work staff's done, and then as Rosie outlined, the emphasis on a lot of the populations we've been talking about a lot more in the last 12 months. So I appreciate the work that's been done. This obviously is a release for comment. So looking forward to getting feedback on the plan.
Yep. All right. Thank you, James, and thank you, Rosie, for the work. We'll also look forward to those comments. But at this point, we don't need to take an actual vote on this, though, right? There's not a.
Well, we probably need a motion to recommend to the full board approval of the outreach starting. So I will make that motion.
All right.
I'll second that.
All right. Kozlowski and Gog. Any further questions, comments? All right. Seeing none, roll call, please.
And when I call your name, please indicate your vote. Director Bernasconi.
Yes.
Director Burris. Absent. Frericks. Absent. Gog.
Yes.
Lozano. Absent. Middleton.
Aye.
Stollard.
Aye.
Thomas. Absent. Vice Chair Kozlowski.
Yes.
And Chair Saragosa.
Yes.
Motion carries.
All right. Great. Thank you. Okay. Our next items are information items. Item 6, and that's the next generation transit strategy for the SACOG region. And Chris Doherty has this presentation for us this morning. Thank you, Chris.
Good morning, Chair and members of the committee. Thank you. Bear with me for a second while I share my screen. And a quick confirmation, can everyone see the lead slide for the presentation?
Yes.
Yes.
Great, thank you very much. So yes, good morning. My name's Chris Doherty. I'm with the transportation group here at SACOG. And the item before you today are the draft strategies for the next generation transit study. I'm seeking feedback on those today from you. The next generation transit study began last summer and really aims to articulate a vision for transit throughout the Sacramento region over the next 20 years. This plan will produce a set of long-term strategies, again, that pair with the MTP horizon of 20 years, but also a set of near-term strategies that are designed to be implemented within the next 5 years that help us point us on that path. This work has been guided by 2 stakeholder groups, a policy advisory committee that is made up of representatives from community groups and business organizations, generally voices we don't hear in the transit area and transit realm, and the technical advisory committee, which is comprised of our transit operators in the region to give their technical feedback on the strategy that we're proposing. So I said the vision for this plan is to really outline what that long-term vision for transit is in our region. Our MTP SCS really relies on transit to move the people that we expect to move into our region over the next 20 years. So with that, we really aim to offer frequencies and speeds and service to make transit generally more competitive with driving a single occupancy vehicle. We want to address the mobility disparities for disadvantaged communities in the SACOG region. We want to make transit attractive to as a trip, as a mode in the region. And we want to be able to leverage innovations and technology into this realm and think a little bit outside of the bus as we move forward throughout this vision. So through the existing conditions analysis that we completed with this project, really 3 things came to light in our region, because our region is a very diverse region across all 6 counties. But really that transit trips are much longer than comparable vehicle trips, 4 to 6 times longer on average. Transit is not meeting the needs of our regional travelers, those who move in and out of counties and to our job centers. And existing land use really makes the delivery of the existing methods we have to deliver transit very difficult and very expensive. So we need new ways of doing that. So the set of strategies that are following are kind of, this is the context where they came from. We realized through this project was scoped and contemplated in a pre-pandemic world, but we have tailored this a little bit more since the pandemic happened in the middle of the project. And since this happened, we've had a fairly major shift and have increased growth in the Sacramento region far more than expected over the past year. So we have some big demographic shifts that are happening. Funding is scarce for the transit community, whether it's capital funding or operational dollars. We need to figure out a way to find consistent operational dollars for our transit operators. As I said earlier, transit riding is slow. We need to prioritize infrastructure that really speeds up our transit vehicles in the region. And because transit is slow, those who are transit dependent and our disadvantaged communities really feel the burden of those disparities when it comes to long travel times. So this slide really speaks to the regionality of our trips in the region. This is the destinations that are outside of downtown Sacramento. And this is derived from the replica data, the big data platform that SACOG is currently piloting. This is all trips, this is not transit trips. So this shows where people are going to in the region. And about 30 to 40% of those people are moving in and out of counties when our transit operators are generally bound by smaller districts than people move. So some of the strategies that we are recommending here today really get to how do we make more regional travel for transit through the different operators happen more seamlessly for the users. So we've taken those strategies, both long and short-term strategies, and really put them into 4 buckets or categories. They are seamless user experience, planning and funding, and transit delivery and design, or design and delivery. But also cross-cutting through all of those is reducing mobility disparities for disadvantaged communities. So I'll talk a little bit, there's a lot of content on this slide, I understand, as we go through the strategies. I'm not going to read all this to you. I'll talk about them at a fairly high level. Feel free to stop me anytime and ask a question. But this is under the seamless user experience bucket of strategies. We've kind of broken it up into 3 categories: cohesive, comfortable, and connected. Cohesive really focuses on, and comfortable, these 2 strategy buckets really focus on how our systems operate and making them feel more integrated across the different areas of our region and different operators of our region. Right now, it's very difficult if you want to plan a trip across a couple different operators. If you want to, looking at the schedules and things like that, that can be a very cumbersome and a friction point if someone wants to make that decision. And then paying for those trips is also cumbersome. You have several different transit fares you have to pay at one time. So we're looking at strategies that make that easier, maybe a regional route planning data portal, or in ways that we can integrate, like we use our Connect card across multiple platforms, and maybe do that through an application. So those are some of the long-term strategies that we're looking at for the seamless user experience. And connected really is, how do we also program either more flexible ways of delivering transit, whether it's how do we pair micromobility, bike share. We've had very, very large successes here with bike share and scooter share in the region. Those can be very supportive for transit. If someone doesn't need needs to make trips at the end of their transit trip, micromobility choices really handle those 1 to 2 mile trips very easily. So we're looking at strategies around how do we integrate those. So this slide speaks to some of the feedback we got from the various stakeholder groups that we've talked to. Our policy advisory committee really was looking at more of a economic development thoughts around moving people around, not just outside of your daily trips and your commute trips. So looking at recreation, agritourism as options we should be exploring. Really trying to activate the stations, and we have a big opportunity here and a lot of growing national movement around mobility hubs and how to program those stations to be busier with people as than our standard park and rides are. And really this group really wanted to focus on what those tangible strategies that we can start deploying in 1 to 5 years, and how do we do that. The technical advisory committee, made up mostly of our transit operators, was really focusing on the things that they're struggling with right now, which are access to stations. We need ADA access to stations. That can be just as important as speed of the transit vehicles. But really, they're just trying to cover the nuts and bolts right now. They've gone through a major shift in ridership over the past year. They were already on decline before that, but the pandemic has definitely exacerbated some of those trends. So we really want to look at, they're trying to just cover their standard operations right now. But they're very interested in how riders can transfer across different operators through our region. For planning and funding, the strategic section really focuses on kind of some of those back office process improvements to help us plan things together as a region. Our short range transit plans, or SRTPs, and I apologize for some of the acronyms in here. It's a fairly dense slide. We are looking at ways that we can streamline those and align them so that they all come in at the same time. So as a regional entity, we can look at those plans and find out where there are benefits and think people can work together. For responsive, this really speaks to helping our operators understand how people move around the region, and helping at a regional level focus on getting the feedback to the operators and how they can best serve people in the region. Sorry. Again, the Policy Advisory Committee really liked the idea of how to help travelers, move from one transit operator to another to make that as seamless and as easy as possible. And like the idea of that kind of back-end planning for good regional buy-in. The other benefit of the SRTP alignment is it will also help us be more competitive and tell a better story when it comes to competitive grant programs. The Technical Advisory Committee was also supportive of this, especially through some support from SACOG, in which we have a fairly robust group of that we support through these processes. For transit delivery and design, this is really on how we deliver transit in our region. Targeted really speaks to focusing the service on where there is ridership, understanding that we have had a tendency in the transit industry for the past several decades of covering as much land as we can, but that is making trip times very long. So if we can focus to those corridors, we can move more people in a bus. There's nothing more efficient than a filled 40-foot bus at moving people. Then we can increase ridership and better serve our land uses. FAST really speaks to getting at that identified problem where transit trips are slower in our region. And there are little strategies that we can use when it comes to either on the freeways, short-term strategies could be bus on shoulder techniques that we can work on those policies with Caltrans and our state partners, but also our local jurisdictions on queue jumps and signal upgrades that help transit move faster through our congested areas. Flexible really speaks to some of the more innovative delivery services that we've seen. Our region has seen really good successes and benefits from micro transit options, thinking the West Sacramento VIA program or regional SACRT Smart Ride program. Those micro transit on-demand systems can do a really good job of covering low density development areas without running a 40-foot bus on regular intervals through. While it might be a higher cost per rider, but they to cover that area might be cheaper on the long run until transit really develops in that area. And from our stakeholder, the PAC was really supportive of speeding up buses, especially to move employees around and access to job centers. And also really focusing on how do we identify the new travel patterns in a post-pandemic environment. The Technical Advisory Committee was also very focused on this, but really was on what those new travel patterns are, and really looks to SACOG as we do our modeling, as we move in our planning to help with that. But also how to identify funding sources that we can better focus on the transit delivery that our region needs. They also, the important thing here that they identified is our transit operators are also very interested in speeding up transit, but they don't manage the roads, the public right away that they operate on. So it's really they're looking to us to help with those work with the jurisdictions to find those efficiency benefits through transit speed. So reduce mobility disparities really addresses our equity issues through this project. The inclusive section really speaks to getting new voices that we generally don't hear about in transit planning to speak up, and how do we really address the neighborhoods that have been historically disadvantaged or under-resourced when it comes to transit and mobility options in general. And equitable really is just about increasing modal travel choice for these disadvantaged communities. This is also where it comes into the private public-private partnerships like microtransit and micromobility. Some of these are operated by private operators that don't always want to go into these areas. It's really our region's goal to make sure that these areas have all those same modes presented, as well as to our other areas that just generally drive ridership. So from the Policy Advisory Committee, they really want, they acknowledge, and we really need cross-county regional engagement when it comes to equity. They identified that as really important. And to that, for some of our disadvantaged communities, there is not a redundancy in modes. They only have maybe transit options or walking and biking. Those options need to be presented to all residents of the region. And the Technical Advisory Committee really was concerned about the definition for disadvantaged communities. And this is something that, SACOG can help with. Generally, that was keyed around funding opportunities, because funding programs sometimes have different definitions of disadvantaged communities to open up funding options. We also really wanted to focus on, since we have such a diverse region, how do we deliver mobility and transit options to our rural communities? That is something that has been something we've wanted to look at for a while, but really understanding that the needs of these communities, really differ from our urban and suburban communities, and need probably a different lens and different thought process when it comes to delivering mobility options. Is it a bus? Is it more microtransit? Is it something as simple as volunteer driver programs? We wanted a better suite of options for our rural communities, so that everybody has the same options that we do in our more urban and suburban areas. So that concludes the general presentation and the draft strategies. I'm available for any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Chris. A lot of information. So I'll open it up to directors if there's any questions. Yes, Director Stollard.
Thank you. I certainly enjoyed that presentation. Gave us some good ideas. It's really timely for the kind of conversations we're having at the Yolo County Transportation District. What I'm wondering, Chris, is if you'd be willing to bring that presentation to the other transit district boards like ours, so that we can hear it and consider it. Obviously, I've now had it, but I'd like to hear it again. I'd like my colleagues to hear it.
Director Stollard, I'm actually already in conversations with Jose Perez at YCTD about making a presentation possibly in June to your board. So yes, I'm very open to that.
All right, well, we meet next Monday at 7 o'clock. So I just put an email out. Is it chris.doherty@sacog.org?
cdoherty@sacog.org, yes.
Yeah, I'll get a bounce back then, so I'll send it again. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, thank you, Director Stollard. Any other questions? Chris, I had a question in terms of the working groups. Were they building towards any type of consensus, or at least what data was showing in regards to sort of post-pandemic and ridership levels as we go forward? I can tell you, because I do use my El Dorado transit, and it's still really low. I mean, I used it recently, and I was like, there were like 5 of us on there, but usually it's a fairly full rapid transit down to Sacramento, and it's predominantly state workers. But obviously it's causing fiscal issues and other concerns as we move forward, knowing that this may be sort of a new norm in terms of people working from home. So I don't know how much of that played into the discussions.
So the data that we had, the trip data that we had, and ridership data we got did extend into the pandemic period, but ended in about fall when they're doing that analysis. We are actively looking to see, what we don't have a crystal ball. It's really hard to gauge what's going to happen in a post-pandemic environment. But I know that especially the commuter routes have been especially hit. That's where we've seen the highest reduction in transit ridership. And unfortunately, those are also some of the most revenue generating routes for our operators. So they're kind of getting a 1-2 punch when that happens. So we're working pretty closely with the state and some of the large employees in the region, trying to figure out when they're coming back and what that will look like. But as of right now, that stuff is still moving pretty quickly, and we don't have a really clear idea what that's going to look like right now.
Okay. And as Director Stoller said, I'm not on transit this year, but I'm sure El Dorado Transit would be great to have you come up, give the same presentation.
I'm happy to reach out to them.
Here, Saragossa, just to add on to your comment there, it's an excellent one, right? Which is what's happening with the state and what's their plan for reopening. And without getting into a big discussion, I think we're probably all aware, even if the state is, California is quote unquote reopening June in a week, that doesn't mean that all the state offices are reopening. And we're working to try to figure out exactly what that might look like. I don't think there is a cohesive plan yet, but clearly, whatever it looks like after the pandemic is not what it's going to look like before the pandemic. And so I would suggest, again, back to the importance of this whole initiative, we have to have transit that is flexible, that actually can be tailored to and geared to changing, whether it's work patterns or travel patterns, right? It's great that we have a light rail system, but I think as Chris is saying, we also think there's a tremendous potential that we're not yet maximizing with bus, and not just 40-foot buses, a much more flexible system. The other thing that I just want to say, well, I found a couple of things very interesting just in terms of your role as local government officials, but maybe I'll let other directors weigh in if you have questions.
I have a question, if I may.
Mm-hmm.
I guess part of the puzzle here seems to be making public transit speedier and more dispersed, so that the sort of last mile problem gets somewhat resolved. How to get to the transit. So the light rail, for instance, can only run on its tracks. You have to get to one of its stations, right? And if so there's that issue, and then separate from that, there's the expectation that everyone has about what convenient travel is, which is in their personal car by themselves, or better yet, in a limousine being driven around by somebody to exactly where they want to go when they want to go there. And I'm asking this question in the context of regional transit starting their RT Go program, which is basically RT as Uber with some limitations. And I'm just wondering, are we trying to be too many things when it comes to public transportation? Should we actually be retreating rather than trying to aggressively add super convenient services when Uber exists and Lyft exists and the light rail trains have a purpose and regular bus routes have a purpose? So I'm just, how do we ultimately sort of declare victory that we're providing adequate service if we're moving the goalpost, way down the field in terms of what the expectations for public transportation are? And I know that's a lot kind of rolled into one thing, but I guess I'm not seeing the end of the story here. I'm seeing a lot of, really aggressive thinking in terms of adding services to reach some magical, equitable perfection in the future without a lot of funding available.
There's always that caveat.
Yeah, so there's that.
Chris, do you want to tackle that? You want me to take a go?
I'm happy to start. And yeah, you're hitting on a lot of key issues that I think are very important. There is a lot of role for public-private partnerships in innovation in the transit industry moving forward. But as we have also realized, there are some challenges with that too, when it comes to just relying on Uber and Lyft as they are private companies. We had a similar thing happen here around the jump bike system, where at the beginning of the pandemic, they just pulled the bikes up and entire really successful mode disappeared without the control of our, we had no control over that. So there is a lot of opportunity sometimes in that space where it's not just the public entities operating, but there are some challenges or cons to that as well. What this is looking to doing is kind of moving our transit operators into thinking maybe outside the bus a little bit, and how can they address the needs of people moving around, maybe through different, more innovative measures that I think are important. And we probably can't get to our GHG goals that are outlined in the MTPS SCS without doing that. Because if our future is strictly just cars, even if they are electrified, we can't build enough roadways to really accommodate the growth that's going to happen in our region.
Can I offer some thoughts?
Yeah, Director Stollard.
Yeah, we've had our own study over at Yolo County Transportation District. This is YOLO Bus, and I'm fairly new back on the board. I was there years ago, but there's a lot of wonderful new thinking happening. It's pretty consistent with the presentation we just heard. We have a real successful route called the 42. It runs in a circle from downtown Sacramento to the airport, to Woodland, to Davis, to West Sacramento. It goes clockwise and counterclockwise. Right now it's hourly service. We're planning to take it to half hourly. And the consultant we've engaged is suggesting that we maybe go so frequently that you don't even have to have a schedule, like 10 or 15 minutes. And favor that over everything else we do, and then use local, more point-to-point service to get to one of two places in each city where it stops, instead of 5, 6, 7 or more stops in each city. That's what makes the route take so long. So I'm part of the way we'd fund this, Mike, to your specific concern, which I share, is by eliminating perhaps the local bus route within our own town. In other words, there may be some savings from eliminating that and going to point. Now, I suspect you're like me. I don't want to stand on a corner next to a bus stop. I don't want to walk to wherever the bus stop is. The way the VIA system in West Sac works is they may direct you to a nearby corner, but you're fairly close to where you start, and they may drop you off at a corner fairly close to where you want to go. So what that means is, inside our community for intra-woodland travel, you would get point-to-point service essentially. But for external, going to Davis or West Sac or out to the casino, you'd go to a modal point where you connect with those buses going there. You get it? So instead of having 7 stops for the 42 in Woodland and 7 stops, or 3 or 4 in Davis and many in West Sac, you only have 2 in each town. So that bus is moving faster on that circle. And then we use our little local point-to-point system to get you to those multimodal points. Okay. Well, anyway, this is all theory at this point, but that's why I'm hoping Chris will come talk to us to reinforce this thinking.
Well, so Tom, thank you very much for sharing that. The the SAC RT Go program is supposed to serve a similar purpose as that point to point or limited points to point kind of service, separate from the legitimate point to point that's for people with accessibility issues. So that they're doing that right, or they're starting to do that right now.
I'm sure there are good models too around the country. Maybe Chris could share, or James, I know, is fairly familiar with where this is really working well.
But if I can say though, Tom, I think you reinforced my point that maybe there's some things that have to fall off the table to be able to use that model. Some routes have to go away in order to do that.
Yeah, in West Sacramento, I think the local bus routes are still in place alongside the VIA system, but nobody was sure how the transition would work, and I think that's still being resolved. So good point.
Yeah.
I think Chris, you brought up I think a lot of questions for a lot of us. I almost feel like we could have spent maybe a whole committee meeting, just talking through the intricacies of these. And I'm wondering if it's we shouldn't come back to this. We're going to have to keep moving. I see Director Gogg's hand up, and then we'll need to move on to the next topic after. But Director Gogg.
Thank you, Chair. I was looking at the public transportation. It seemed like that a lot of the buses only got 4 or 5 riders in it. At this point, are we looking for more speed on the bus, or are we looking for more efficiency of the present routes? It seems like that more people are moving away from public transit with the fear of catching some kind of a disease from touching something. Are we going to have to wear gloves all the time when we're out there doing things, wear masks? And that's kind of seemed like the public transportation at that time does not look very practical when, like the other director said, that we prefer to have a limo driver drive us around rather than be on the public transit. I mean, I see a little bit of public transit going through Live Oak. We had two bus routes there, one in the morning and one in the afternoon. And we had difficult time getting people to ride the bus because of the fact that the route takes longer than what you could do with an automobile. So in Europe, I noticed that there's people all over these buses. You can find barely standing room at some time because they're more orientated toward that type of a transportation. Where here in America, we're like a very, very independent people, and we really have difficult time think of riding a bus. I mean, if we don't have some kind of automobile, we think like we're a second-class citizen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Director Gogg. Well, again, I think a lot of conversation here, and I don't know the timing, but I wouldn't mind seeing this come back and have a little bit more in-depth conversation here to give our thoughts and directions on this. But with that, do we have any public comments on this issue?
There are no public comments.
Okay, thank you, Robert. All right, well, to be continued, and we're going to go ahead and move on to item 7, which is our Council of Governments overview. And Connor has his presentation for us this morning. So thank you, Connor.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair and members of the committee. I'm going to share my screen. Can you guys see the PowerPoint?
Yep.
Cool. So my name is Connor Peterson. I'm a shared services analyst with your SACOG staff. Really enjoyed that discussion focused around transportation and what the future of transportation looks like. I'd say you often think about, when you think about SACOG, as a transportation focused agency, but we're going to shift. Oop, did I mix that up a little? Sorry about that. I'm gonna stop sharing for a second. Sorry about that. There we go. So you'd often think about SACOG as a transportation-focused agency, but we're going to shift gears here, talk a little bit about some other services that SACOG plays in its Council of Government function. So I'm going to try and shorten it up a little bit, a 10 to 15 minute discussion for looking at an overview of our Council of Government, or COG role. So I'll start at a higher level of kind of what a COG represents, get a little bit more in the weeds and touch on some specific programs falling within our Council of Government role, and also highlight, hopefully why this matters. Hope to better orient to where there's opportunity and how your staff can best leverage our services under our COG role, and then also touch on some overarching questions as we look forward with the program, or with various programs, and how we continue to best serve our membership. So a COG can be administered by multiple governments, or also in a single government agency, as you know, in San Joaquin County, specifically on the county side. But as you all are very well aware, we're a multiple government agency representing the 6-county region, binded through a joint powers agreement, making us a JPA, or a joint power authority. A JPA, in this JPA, it specifically outlines some mandates for services to be performed by SACOG. While there are specific mandates, it is a little bit more open-ended into what SACOG in the way of services can perform. So I've taken a shot at breaking them up into two a little bit broader categories. So we have our state and federal requirements, what we're mandated to do, and then our regionally driven services. So these are services that were driven by the board over time. And so breaking that up, on the mandated service side, there's obviously on the housing front, regional housing needs and allocation process. We're getting to the tail end of that. It's an 8-year process. We also provide technical assistance for your housing elements. Happy to hear that lots are being taken and approved through your councils and boards. We have data and analysis, so basic and technical assistance, which falls along the lines of transportation, land use, air quality. We're also a liaison for the census. And then there's regionally driven services. So you'll hear obviously a bit more, and you've heard a lot over time on the advocacy front. That's something we've definitely been emphasizing in recent years, hiring a policy manager in Christina, and as well as state and federal lobbyists, seeking state level programs that can bring on funding. We have shared services, which is the program that I work within. So it's basically looking at centralizing operations, things like economies of scale, building cost and time efficiencies, and then we have broader program implementation. So I guess that's where we can get a little bit more creative with some of our programs. So thinking YLA, Civic Lab, race equity and inclusion. These functions are all financed through federal planning funds, as well as member dues are a crucial portion that especially finances our advocacy and technical assistance. And then we also have administrative fees realized through our shared services contracts. So it's actually private funds that come to support these shared initiatives. So one thing to emphasize is we're in looking at the benefits associated with the council or the COG role is trying to bring the most value, piecing together what we're required to provide and what we have been driven by as regional priorities. You'll notice the regional programs, they really link to our core work on the transportation, planning, land use front. So here we have technical assistance, so helping with pursuing grants by your staff in helping with grant applications, linking to the housing element. We had rural main streets, which this committee had heard in previous months, and a great assistance to our smaller jurisdictions, convening and collaboration, so that can be done at the board level, but we can also have working groups at the local level, or kind of ad hoc groups that are come together around a regional issue. We did that when the Orville spillway failure, where we brought together state, local, police, fire, to really discuss and see better ways that we could coordinate in the future on the disaster front. Like I said, we have creative programs like youth leadership, Civic Lab, innovative mobility, race equity inclusion. So they're stepping a little bit outside of transportation and planning as a whole, in more of a regional program. So, and then we have operations focus, supporting your day-to-day operations and making it easier for you to pick up these services and really use them. So specifically shared services, it could definitely cover a really broad scope, all things operationally within local government. So often I would say when you think about shared services, you think police, fire, regional 911 centers, animal control. We've tended to focus a bit more, and I think it's definitely been mentioned previously, on kind of the back office functions, specifically procurement and contracting. And I know when you hear that, that definitely does not sound like something that is exciting or necessarily pushing the limit, but it's really a core function to the way that we do business and the way we interact with the private sector. Addressing those pain points and making it easier to work with the private sector has definitely been something we've tried to push towards. You'll notice on the consent calendar, we have a high resolution aerial imagery purchase. We've actually been doing this for about 12 years, where we work with GIS departments to perform a single flyover for the region. And they'll take, I guess what you would think like Google Earth images that they then use throughout their departments. We do that for economies of scale to assist your jurisdictions in not having to perform that procurement. And we've had great success this time around. We've doubled the amount of the region that's participating on it. We have 5 counties. I think we're only missing 1. And we've also done this in other ways with bulk fuel. We have a $15 million contract that SACOG manages that saves the region about $1 million over the life of the contract. And that also brings in specific funding to support these programs through a small fee. And this is really efforts on the ground assistance. We believe that, or hope that these are responsive services to your needs. And so we've also on the consent calendar, you'll see a pavement item, which comes from the conversations around the region, where we're looking at road and maintenance to see how we can save our jurisdictions money and stretch that valuable maintenance funding. We've landed more so on the data front in thinking in helping on their pavement planning. It's been done in the Bay Area too as well in MTC, our sister agency. So we're working to basically collect all of the pavement condition data throughout the region. We use that within our funding rounds, as well as coordinating with the state level. This is kind of the first step in looking at road maintenance as a whole and building towards more potential shared services that can really be that all-in-one service that can save your jurisdictions and really stretch those maintenance dollars. Also, a program, I don't know if it's been discussed as specifically this year or as much this year in this committee, but it is an arm of innovative mobility, which has come through this committee, which is our take on a local government accelerator. Monica Hernandez came and discussed our focus around design thinking. This program is really that key example in how we try and incorporate those progressive principles, whether it be mobility or commercial corridors. So we work with local government staff to fully understand a specific challenge and address them through workshops, peer-to-peer sharing, and private sector pilots. Really focusing on being a connector between business to government as well as government to government. So within this program as well, we took a different approach to procurement. We circled back. We had seen some great best practices around the country in this front. So instead of exactly scoping out what a challenge may be, we have more of, it's called a challenge-based procurement. So we put it out there to the private sector in the hopes that they can bring awesome solutions, and it kind of follows along those lines of you don't know what you don't know, which we've had some great interactions and conversations with the private sector as well as pilots on the ground resulting from these. Really through these programs too as well is trying to bring a menu of services to our membership. So thinking on bringing a workshop. In the case of Civic Lab, there was available funding that was connected to our funding round, and then direct access to the private sector solutions. Another program that you've heard definitely a lot about recently, REAP. So this is more following along the mandated service function, but we've tried to do a bit more outside of just kind of a grant that's being mandated through the state. So it's housing planning funds that are being distributed down, but we've had workshops. We've pre-qualified a full bench of consultants that can work directly with our jurisdictions. And I believe at this time there's 8 to 10 of our jurisdictions who are looking to leverage this bench. So really performing, again, that procurement upfront so that your staff don't have to go through the months-long process of going out and getting or bringing on a consultant to perform that work. Also, we're looking at, and it's really getting more in the weeds, but on the contract administration side and really helping to administer that grant on the back end, which sometimes the invoicing and kind of that whole process can be a little bit burdensome. So we're trying to take that lift off of jurisdictions. So quickly, why this matters, we want you to maximize our available programs. And you know, we're trying to provide that menu of services, as well as, you know, participating on our existing contracts, mapping the priorities for the region. We're always interested to hear what your needs are, whether it be, you know, maybe a budget constraint, or you're looking at we need to focus on pension crisis and have discussions on this front. We engage through that with our regional managers group as well, through our the city managers and county executives. But obviously, this committee it's crucial in letting us know what the priorities are for the region, or maybe where the pain points are. And so that falls as well into elevating regional issues, and just continuing to communicate with us on that front is valuable in us addressing and being able to build out services and or meet your needs. So few overarching questions. Do these types of services and kind of the focus areas, where should SACOG be focusing its discretionary COG services? So those regionally driven services. How do we best balance the needs of our jurisdiction? So the difference between an Isleton and a Sac County, you know, there's some on some side definitely need more operations assistance on the back end, and having that bench of consultants ready to go. But we have seen them being leveraged by jurisdictions of all shapes and sizes. And are there other ways that we can fund these efforts? There's creative, and I guess that feeds into actually what comes next, which is obviously program implementation as a whole. Christine is going to talk more on the advocacy front, but also analyzing fiscal supportive services, which kind of leads into potential opportunity in thinking of a nonprofit, as you can seek out more specific grants that can support this work. We have tried to get creative in some ways through, as I mentioned, through our shared contracts, where we get basically we're saving money for the region, and then also sourcing private funds to support these services. But there's other creative ways that we can implement these programs. And local funds, that's definitely a huge learning, or just flexible funds in general are key for implementing more creative programs under our COG role. But I think that is it. So if there's any specific questions or elaborate any further, I don't know if Eric or James too, if there's any additional comments.
Thank you, Connor. Board members, any comments, or James?
We just really wanted to make sure you had an understanding of some of the things that we offer that you know, are kind of going along in the engine room at SACOG, and also you know, as new things come along, as Connor mentioned, you know, how can SACOG best position itself to help all of you in your day-to-day activities? So really just wanted to raise some awareness, but you know, if there's any reactions to these questions here or at a future meeting, happy to engage with all of you on those.
Great. Thank you, Eric.
I think Chair Saragosa, again, because we have a lot of new members, new board members on this board and this committee. Again, that was just why we wanted to come back at you with, and this is really the committee that oversees a lot of these Council of Governments functions. But I'd say a couple things to wrap this up. We're not just a transportation planning agency, as we've often said. We actually have shared services currently And Connor went through a number of those, which we hope that you know about and that your jurisdictions, and we talk to your city managers and county execs, but I have in my time here had a couple of conversations where a board member said, boy, I didn't even know that you all had this on contract. And I wish I had known that before we went and did this by ourselves, because it would have been a lot cheaper. And then finally, just making sure that you all understand, we have a lot of opportunity, a lot of potential here. And that's really what Connor's trying to tee up with these questions. There's more we can do in service to all of you. We've got to be thoughtful, strategic, think about staff capacity and resources as we're saying here. But anyway, it's a good, I think, table setting for us to come back to you with some more specifics on the COG side of SACOG.
Absolutely. Thank you, James. Do we have any public comments on this item?
No public comment.
Okay, thank you, Robert. All right. Let's go ahead then and move on to our advocacy update and with Christina. So good morning, Christina.
Hi, good morning. Thank you. So it seems like every month I start off by commenting on how busy things are here in NDC, and this month is no different. So today we're first going to hear from our new federal lobbyists, and then I'll give a brief state update. Just as a quick reminder, about a little over a month ago, we contracted with Capital Transportation Consulting and Pavlicek and Associates for our federal lobbying services. And they've really hit the ground running during this very busy time. Excuse me. So Devin and Jason are here with us today to introduce themselves and give us an update on their work. So I will waste no time and pass it over to them now.
Great.
Hi, I'm Devin Barnhart. It's nice to meet you all. And I will turn it over to Jason to say hi first.
Hello, Jason Pavlicek. Pleasure to meet you. I have been a transportation advocate for the better part of 25 years. All of my work is in the infrastructure, transportation, transit, ITS world. It's a real pleasure to work with you all. Looking forward to working with you. Devin.
Hi, I'm Devin Barnhart. I am a civil engineer and I'm also a lawyer. I spent several years working for the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation. I worked in their planning office, I worked in their bridge office, and all of that time working at the state really just made me wonder why we were making the policy decisions that we were, and that led me to Congress, and I spent the better part of 10 years working in Congress, the last half of which was for the Surface Transportation Subcommittee in the Senate, and so worked on the FAST Act and sort of intimately familiar with federal policy, but really love bridging the divide between what's happening on the ground and how federal policy interacts with what folks are doing locally. Since it's been a while since SACOG has had anyone representing them at the federal level, we thought it would be useful to just sort of talk about like, what do we even do when we're in DC? Sometimes lobbying gets a bad rap, but really I always try to tell people like lobbying is really just trying to help people speak a foreign language. Congress has its own language. They have their own way of writing things. The administration is always sort of doing things and it's never as clear as we would like it. And so your federal lobbyists are really here to support you, to help do that kind of translation and to make sure that you are in the know of sort of everything that's going on in the world so that you don't have to be on the ground tracking it every single day like we do. And really, first and foremost, just really want you to think of an extension of your team in DC. Just to give you a sense of some of the things that we do, we make sure that we have really good relationships on both sides of the aisle and with the administration. We've had long-term friends that we've worked with for years and years that work on transportation policy and infrastructure in general. We maintain all those relationships, but we also work with a whole host of external stakeholders. There are too many to ever name, but there are thousands of groups that work in the DC area around transportation and infrastructure. And it's the kinds of groups that you probably hear about, counties, the states, it's all those associations that work together. And so we sort of stay in the know with them too, so that we can help leverage the points that we're working on with you all. We also do a whole host of brainstorming around policy development, drafting policy, drafting language, and then keeping an eye on all the issues that are moving in the city, whether it's on the Hill or within the administration. And then last and not least, we sort of take the ideas that we've worked with you guys, and we really execute and develop strategies so that no matter what's moving in DC, because things change frequently, we always have sort of a plan to keep pushing forward the agenda. And then just a couple of things to note about Congress. Sometimes Congress gets labeled as a do nothing Congress, and it's really like something the media likes to talk about. And but one thing to know is Congress is always working. It doesn't look that way necessarily in the press because things are happening behind the scenes. And some of our issues, as much as I hate to say that transportation isn't the sexiest issue, you know, it's not always at the forefront of what's happening in the news media. So anyhow, even when people say things aren't happening in Congress and in DC, they are. People are planning, they're writing bills, they're thinking about policy, and they're prepping. So that's something that Jason and I will that's the things we babysit. We're sort of always on the ground watching. And one thing to flag right now in Congress, the opposite problem is happening. This is the opposite of do nothing. They are doing everything right now. And there's a lot happening. So I thought today we would just give you the big picture of what folks are talking about, what they mean when they say infrastructure, what they mean when they say they're negotiating with Biden. We're just going to give you like really big picture about what's happening. And if in the future you want us to hone in on any of the specifics, we're always happy to do that as well. So for the past 18 months since COVID, all Congress has really been focused on is providing emergency funding to help people deal with COVID, whether that's medical supplies, prepping for the vaccinations, preparing the vaccinations themselves, all the world of impact, the impact on businesses, et cetera, has really been uniquely and singularly the focus of Congress. And this doesn't happen very often where sort of all the committees are working on one thing. It follows catastrophic events when this happens. But to just give you a sense, these are Congress has spent over $5 trillion getting funding out the door as an emergency response to just keep people afloat over the course of the pandemic. When I originally wrote this slide, I put B's next to this, like 1.9 billion. And I was like, oh goodness, trillion. Like we're in astronomical numbers that were necessary to help keep the economy and to keep families afloat. Just to give you a sense, most of the funding was not targeted at transportation, but there was a significant portion. So a large funding went to state and locals to help folks as tax receipts dropped and to help sort of fund all the extra costs that cities were facing in response to the pandemic. And then on transportation specifically, it was in the press constantly, airlines, airports, all were hit really hard. In that same sense, transit numbers of ridership dropped dramatically, 90% and higher in some spots. And it really took the federal government bolstering those systems to keep them alive during the pandemic. And even with the funding that Congress was putting out, folks were shutting down stations, they were lowering service. Amtrak, for instance, shortened and ended some of its long distance routes. It was really a big pain point in the transportation space to not have these passenger services. And so Congress stepped in and provided a significant amount of money to get them through. Not all of them are out of the weeds. I think transit's looking really good, but passenger rail still has some challenges. Congress also provided a little bit of funding to help state DOTs. And so folks saw a little bit of that money come through as gas tax receipts and other issues, other funding sources sort of plummeted in the wake of the pandemic. So if that was all focused on what happened in the past, now we're sort of shifting to like, what does it mean for our country now and what does economic recovery look like? This slide, I'm really just trying to show two things. One is on the bottom half of this chart are all the bills that we've thought of in the past as sort of like gigantic transformational bills. The New Deal, the Marshall Plan, ARA is the stimulus that Obama introduced. Those were previously gigantic bills. And then you can start to see up the side are like the COVID bills come into place. And those are sort of we're just astronomically funneling federal money into the system. And then above the chart is everything that's been in place that President Biden has proposed since he came into office. The American Rescue Plan on the right, that is already out the door. That is emergency funding. It was part of that COVID package that I just talked about. American Jobs Plan, I'm going to spend most of my time focused on that. That's infrastructure. That's the spot where we're really watching. And then the American Family Plans is really focused on helping families, kids, tax credits for children, educational funding, a little bit outside of the scope of any of the issues that we focus on. But this is the world of funding that we're dealing with, and it's big dollars. And when you try to inject this massive amount of funding, it comes with a lot of consternation and a lot of challenging negotiations. So to give you a sense of what the president put into his plan, these are just 4 of the big buckets. There are many, many things in the president's proposal for infrastructure, but these are the big takeaways. That first one, building schools, helping folks on the hospital side and aging care, a lot of climate related GHG reduction emissions in that space, transportation and the utility spot. Those are the ones that really deal with the issues that we're focused on. And then the last one on jobs and manufacturing innovation, that's very responsive to what we saw during COVID, which is that our domestic supply chains are very much at risk, and that we really need to rebuild and to bolster those industries. On the transportation piece specifically, there's a lot of good news for the types of things that we all care about. Tons of focus on EV infrastructure. You can think of this as like a moonshot for electric vehicles. We're really trying to make those a reality, and that requires a large federal investment to make sure that those charging stations exist everywhere and that the infrastructure is there to support sort of large scale adoption of electric vehicles. There's a big pot of money for roads and bridges, mostly focused on maintenance and safety of those systems. And then transit and rail, they look a little bit small in comparison to those bigger buckets, but these are really gigantic increases in the amount of federal funding that has been available to support these modes. For just looking at the rail, these numbers are over 5 years. So like we give about over 5 years, I think we give about $10 billion to rail, about $2 billion a year. So anyhow, it ends up being like 8 times the amount of money that the federal government has been providing previously. So this is one shot money, but big, gigantic pots of funding that the president is proposing. On the utility side, very similar. These are large increases in funding, but just to flag a couple of the big issues, it's broadband. That has really massive bipartisan support on the Hill, lots around water, lead pipe replacements, all the sorts of sort of aging infrastructure challenges that we see. This is where things get really sticky. If they weren't already sticky with sort of how big the size of the plan is, it gets really sticky around how do we pay for this. The president has proposed modifying how we've taxed the sort of highest brackets of either businesses or individuals in their incomes, and has really proposed that as the way to pay for this bill. He speaks about it in all of his speeches that the highest earners should be helping to support the long-term goals of the economy.
Devin,
yeah.
can I ask a question real fast on that?
Sure,
How does reconciliation play into that? Because I've gotten tons of conflicting information about whether this could go through reconciliation or, it has to go more traditional manner.
It is. Okay, so I'll just explain reconciliation first. Maybe it actually helps this. The normal course of an order of a bill is that you authorize money for it. So you say, here's how much money that we think we should spend on it. And the appropriations process comes in and says, this is how much money you actually have to spend on it. And then the administration implements that amount of funding. That's the normal course of like every year funding that goes out the door. For reconciliation, and it's bipartisan, you need 60 votes to pass it. It's 50-50 in the Senate right now, so you need 10 Republicans. The House has a Democratic majority, so they could pass it on their own. But it requires a bipartisan effort to get the normal course of funding out the door. And what that normally means is that you get compromise bills. You don't get everything you want. The president wouldn't get everything he proposed. That's how we typically do business. And it's sometimes why Congress gets labeled as do nothing, because it takes a lot to get bipartisan support for anything. Reconciliation, which you hear a lot about in the press, reconciliation is a special budgetary process where you can skip the 60 vote threshold and pass a bill with 50 votes. It is very controversial. It's how they passed the American Rescue Plan. It's very challenging to write that kind of bill because there's all kinds of archaic rules about what can be in it and what can't. And so it's really sort of like it's your last option. If you can't get something bipartisan done and the country desperately needs it, or it's a major priority for your administration, reconciliation is like the end of the road. You've tried everything you can. And so we'll talk a little bit in just a second about sort of what the president is doing to try everything he can before reconciliation comes. Just on this chart, it's a little bit confusing, but the Republicans really highlighted a couple of issues that they had problems with the president plan. One was, oops, how do I go back? Well, one was the slide before this, which was everything dealing with the tax plan. The Republicans put that tax plan into place. They do not want any of it rolled back. And so that remains a big sticking point of like, how do you pay for a massive infrastructure bill? Separate from that, Republicans have also flagged that they think the scope is too broad. They think that when we're talking about economic recovery and the importance of federal dollars boosting the economy, that it should be focused on what they call like true infrastructure, and which is basically, I mean, good news for us. It's mostly the transportation space, some of the broadband and water infrastructure space, but it's not a lot of the two programs like you see on either end. It's not a lot of those programs. So they really shrunk the size of the package and they shrunk the scope. Now, if you look at the various sizes, we're around 600 for transportation, they're around 500, they're around 300, or Democrats around 300 for utilities, Republicans around 100 for broadband and all those issues. Those numbers aren't really that far apart in the scope of things, but there's a lot of haggling still happening. So even as we speak today, the president is meeting with the Republicans again on these numbers to try and see if they can get close to a package. And they might be able to. Folks are getting close to around $1 trillion. Republicans have started to come up into the 800 range. Democrats are dropping down to the $1 trillion range. So they're starting to align on numbers, but the pay for is probably going to be the piece that really makes it difficult. If they can't get to an agreement, if Biden can't work with the Republicans on this issue, they might decide to go the reconciliation route. And that's where they would try to get 50 votes. It is still a very hard path forward to do that. And so because you have to have all 50 Democrats in the Senate support it, and not all 50 Democrats agree with this process. And so Joe Manchin in West Virginia, he gets a lot of airtime in DC because he's already said he wants it to be bipartisan. He wants to find a way to incorporate both sides. So long story short is there's a lot happening on this front. It's all pretty good news for the issues that we care about in the transportation and infrastructure spot. It means a lot of money over a 5-year period could be infused into the system. So that's all good news. It's just, we're sort of a long way off from figuring out what exactly it looks at the end of the day. And then now I'm going to turn it over to Jason to talk about the surface transportation reauthorization, which in exciting and fun news sounds very similar to infrastructure, but is also different. And we'll tackle that at the end.
Just a second. Tom, you had a question before we move on and it gets old in the information. Tom, you want to ask your question?
Thank you. I just wanted to mention that a lot of concern is being felt by our cities and counties for the money designated for us in the American Recovery Plan. There's been talk about clawing back that money to help pay for some of these costs in the transportation bill that you just discussed. I just want you to realize that, you know, your clients are cities and counties as well as Council of Governments. So I hope you'll be sensitive about that issue and not succumb to looking to that as the solution to fund the transportation package. Okay.
It's an important point to highlight. I will say the president has made it pretty clear he does not agree with that as any sort of funding option. And frankly, I'll just tell you that the Democrats used every last lever they possibly could to get that bill passed. They do not want to see those dollars rolled back. Many of them are running for office next year. It's a really tight election again. I think it would be a major political hurdle that I just don't see panning out, but it's a good note, and it's something we'll sort of keep on your radar as those conversations keep coming up.
Thank you.
So I'll jump on reauthorization. I think just to start off, when you know, as I mentioned, I've got 2 young kids, and we showed our kids the movie Ghostbusters this week, and you know, the famous line, "Don't cross the streams." Well, I think with talking about the difference between reauthorization and infrastructure, I like to think about that sort of line from Ghostbusters, because at any moment in time, surface transportation reauthorization is its own stream. Sometimes it crosses over, and we're talking about it as a function of an infrastructure package, and then these words like reconciliation come up. And truth be told, Devin and I spend most of our time trying to describe the difference between the different paths. And the reality of it is that we're talking to staff about the different paths. And there's a lot of confusion here about what is a path forward. And I think what you need to know is that surface transportation reauthorization bill that we are working on sets the policies, sets who gets the money in what form. You know, all the things that we're talking about that I think would benefit SACOG are things that we will actively be dealt with in the surface transportation reauthorization bill, which will need to happen and needs to happen in a bipartisan form, because many of the things that are done in the surface transportation reauthorization bill, the policies and all those things I just talked about, cannot be done through reconciliation. So whether there is a grant infrastructure bill, whether there is a reauthorization of the FAST Act, which was the last transportation bill that passed, there needs to be at some point a new surface transportation policy bill passed at the federal law. And that may get incorporated into a broader quote unquote infrastructure package. It may not. And right now, and Devin, I think you've got to move the slide, so I'm gonna have to just do that. There are multiple committees that are involved in that process. We're not gonna go through all of them today. That would take way more time than we have, but there's a number of congressional committees that handle the reauthorization of the surface transportation bill. Two of those committees are moving right now. Last month at the end of May, the Environment and Public Works Committee, which handles highways, Senator Padilla serves on that committee, marked up their bill. And we'll talk about that in a moment here, about some of the things that are in there that we were able to get in there and what we're working on. And then the surface transportation bill on the highways on the House side is dealt with by the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. And both Congressman Garamendi and Congressman LaMalfa serve on those committees, and we've been talking with them about your priorities that you've outlined. And that legislation will actually be what's called marked up. The committee will sort of take action on it on Wednesday afternoon or Wednesday morning. So next slide. And eventually all these other committees will come together and will pass, and we expect that through the year. So again, just to sort of differentiate between the two, infrastructure is this big picture funding source, broadband sewers, ports, what have you. Reauthorization looks at more policy, setting federal policy for the next 5 to 6 years on transportation. It also includes earmarks. So for those of you who may be a city or a town that submitted earmarks, that policy list or those earmark lists were literally just released within the last 15 minutes. And we'll review those and get the results of that to the folks at SACOG, but that project list has just been announced. And again, that action will take place on Wednesday. Next slide, Devin. So what does this mean for SACOG? We were brought on to help take the vision that you've laid out, which I want to start by saying is it's one of the most aggressive and forward-thinking visions in the country. From afar, I've watched SACOG. I think what you all do is amazing. How you mix, have a mix of both rural and urban needs, and you find a way to create policies, create programs, create initiatives that address both. I think you will serve, and it makes our job easier. You serve as an example of what we want the rest of the nation to be in terms of the planning body and MPOs and COGS and what you do. So I want to start by saying that, but more importantly, I think what we want to do is, as you've laid out this aggressive vision, we want to do two things. One, focus as much money as possible to you. Federal transportation dollars generally go to one of two entities. DOTs are designated recipients in the transit world. What we're working to do is how do we get more money to you as a regional entity, to regional projects like Green Means Go. That is something that is relatively new in many respects to the federal policy, where they give so much power and so much authority to state DOTs. Now, fortunately, you in California have a state law that directly gives or passes through many of those dollars to the COG. That being said, we want to create as much money as possible and create the programs in such a way that allocates as much money as possible to SACOG. So in some cases, that's turning a certain knob this way or turning a certain knob that way in terms of the details of the legislation. That's something that Devin and I are very good at doing. Again, we have, by way, our introduction, both of us only work transportation. So if you ask us how to change healthcare policy, I'm going to shrug my shoulders and tell you I have no idea. But if we want to help allocate $20 million more to Sacramento by making some small changes to the congestion reduction program, we know how to do that. And that's what we're in the process of doing right now. It's going through some of the new programs and some of the discussions that are taking place in Congress and helping them develop some of these new programs, some of these new policies to direct as much money as possible to SACOG. Secondly, we also want to make sure that that money can be used in a way that is most effective and efficient for the region. Sometimes some of the dollars that come to you can be used for this, but not that. We are working with the committees, with the members of Congress, Councilman Garamendi, Senator Padilla, and others, to make sure that when they create these new programs, that SACOG, when they get the money, and as much money as possible, is then able to use that money for as wide of flexible projects as possible, to ensure that we're not having to put together 20 different grants to fund one project. Because you all are I think at the tip of the spear, we're able to work with the committee and say, listen, if you want to see an example, then let's figure out a way to make sure that what SACOG is doing can be done and then duplicated. So a lot of that is just some of the nuances of the legislative language, writing it in a way to ensure that, again, as SACOG gets hopefully some of this program we're calling the urban partnership money, that it has complete ability to do rural projects as well as some of the infill projects that you're working on. So that's sort of what we're working on. A real focus on, I think, some of the smaller details. And again, we can, a little pressed for time, but and more than happy in the future as these bills unveiled, show you what we've done, and then discuss with you what else we can be doing to help sort of nudge these programs in a direction that's more favorable to what you want and how much you get. Devin, I think there's one or two more slides.
Just one, which is, we love to be able to divine sort of like how these two giant bills shape up. But it really is sort of a jump ball right now. We don't know if the president's going to cut a deal with the Republicans. We don't know if the Democrats are going to want to pull that trigger of reconciliation and try to get just 50 votes for the bill. All of those questions are still up in the air. And so we're just moving the ball forward if it's a big funding package on infrastructure, we're trying to move the ball forward there. If it's a surface transportation reauthorization, we want to make sure that there's good policy and funding in that bill. And so we're working on all fronts, and with the end goal that we're going to see the right policy decisions or the right funding package come out at the end. So we'll keep you all informed as it's going through, but there's a lot still at stake and up in the air at this point. Any other questions that we can be helpful answering?
Questions? Well, Jason, Devin, thank you for the update. I think we're excited to have you on the team and representing us in DC. I was lucky enough to be on the interview committee when we did these, and I can say that they stood out well above a lot of good competition, and so really happy to have you part of the team. So thank you.
Thanks so much.
Okay, Christina, I know we're sort of pressed for time, but if you want to give like a 2-minute state update.
Sure, thanks. So like you mentioned, I know we're running late, so I'm going to try to condense all of this real quick. Just a quick update in terms of legislation. Last Friday was the deadline for bills to pass out of the House of Origin. So Senate bills to get out of the Senate, Assembly bills to get out of the Assembly. The legislature will now focus on policy committees in the second House, with the legislature adjourning by September 10th. So that's kind of where we are in terms of policy bills. Obviously, the big focus right now is the state budget, with the constitutional deadline for them to pass a budget by June 15th. And this year we're in the, I suppose, enviable position of having way too much money to come to an agreement. The state's got a very large surplus, plus over $25 billion in federal funds to spend. And so we're in a little bit of a situation of almost too much money, too many priorities, not enough time to figure it all out. So in the staff report, I outlined the governor's revised budget proposal called the May Revise. And then in the slides that you should have for today, last week, the legislature and the Senate and the Assembly came together on an agreement for a budget proposal between the two of them. So a legislative budget proposal. So the slides that you should have compare the governor's proposed budget with the legislature's proposed budget. And now the legislature and the governor have until about June 15th, really about June 12th, so that they can have the bill in print to work out the details for a final budget. All of that, though, is just the dollar amounts. Really, they can continue working on the details through the end of the legislative session. So while we'll see something in the next week or so, we probably will still have a lot of unanswered questions about details in terms of how the funding is going to come out. So again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all the slides and talk about each item, but I do want to talk about this first slide because this is a proposal for a statewide block grant program to help with sustainable community strategies implementation, or SCS implementation, which is essentially what we've been asking for with Green Means Go. So in the governor's May Revised proposal, under the housing section, he proposed $500 million in one-time federal funds, the American Rescue Plan funds, or ARPA funds, to go to the Department of Housing and Community Development, HCD, to provide planning and implementation grants to MPOs for infill development targeted towards the state's climate goals and reducing vehicle miles traveled. And that's pretty much all it says. If it sounds a lot like Green Means Go, I think they'll acknowledge that they heard all of our conversations over these last few years with them about Green Means Go, and it definitely helped influence their proposal. Same thing in the legislature, where their proposed budget added an additional $250 million, so a total of $750 million for this statewide program. Now, everybody's calling it something a little bit different, and so I think that's adding to some of the confusion since there's not a lot of details. People are calling it different things, but it's essentially for SCS implementation. And while a lot of the details need to be worked out, in addition to just reaching an agreement on a dollar amount, I am optimistic that we will be seeing at least some funding. Based on our population, at a minimum, SACOG is likely looking at about $30 million coming to SACOG for Green Means Go and projects that accelerate infill development. However, we are still continuing to strongly advocate for additional funding for the program. And so to include a $100 million allocation to Green Means Go directly in recognition of all of our work the region has done to prepare for this funding and the influence really of our advocacy efforts over these last couple of years. And so again, like they'll likely come to an agreement on that overall number probably by June 15th. It is unlikely that we will necessarily see the details or even if we're going to get that direct $100 million allocation. I do want to thank all of you who have helped reach out to our legislators to continue to make our case, including the committee chair who called into budget committee late, I think it was Wednesday evening, to advocate for direct allocation to Green Means Go. So we're doing that route. We're continuing to meet with staff, KP, our lobbyists are working hard, working with our delegation. I'm doing everything we can to try to get that $100 million direct allocation for Green Means Go. So I'm hesitantly optimistic that we will see money coming to SACOG for Green Means Go and infill development. We should know the details soon, or sorry, we should know the dollar amount soon for a statewide program in the next week, but it might be a little bit longer before we learn any of the details about how much we'll get, how it can be allocated, etc. So trying to keep that condensed. Happy to answer any questions you may have, but I know we're running a bit short on time.
Yes, thank you, Christina. Okay, not seeing any questions. Do we have any public comments?
No public comment.
Okay, great. Thank you, Robert. So we're going to go ahead then. Thank you again, Christina and our federal team, and more to come for sure on that. Yeah, I think trailer bills might go into September, so it might be a while before we know all the funding streams that are out there. So we're going to move on to item 9, which is our broadband resource guide. And our fearless leader, Mr. Corliss, has the intro for this one.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Saragosa. Maybe a couple of years ago, if we had teed this item up, we would be telling you and trying to convince you the importance of broadband. But I think in the last 15 months, I don't have to actually do anything to tell you how important this is. But also, as we continue to look at infrastructure, available funding, and really the divide around access on race, ethnicity, income, broadband looms large in all those categories. So I'm delighted today. We've got one of our key partners, Valley Vision. We have Valley Vision's Executive Director, Evan Schmidt. We also have Trish Kelly and David Espinoza, I believe, from Valley Vision, who are going to present to you an update on a lot of the work that they've been doing, really our leaders here in the region on broadband, but also please give a listen to this with the ear of you all as local governments. Shared services potentially, as we talked about earlier, money that might be coming, how we jump on top of this, what the role of SACOG is, the role of all of you are. So without further ado, Evan.
Thanks, James. And hi, everyone. Really nice to be here. Thanks for having us today. I'm going to pull up this PowerPoint. And James gave us a great introduction as to what we're going to talk to you about today, but it's really to talk about the digital divide here in the region. And as James says, we want to share some resources to help you as local electeds think about how we're expanding access here in our region. And we're also going to really briefly do a little bit of a data overview to show you where some gaps are across our region. So just to speak very quickly about Valley Vision's role, Valley Vision is a civic leadership organization. We work across the 6-county region, and we work to advance economic prosperity, social equity, and environmental sustainability. And one thing I will note about broadband is it cuts across all of those issues. It's a incredibly important and cross-cutting issue, as James noted. And just to note, we have a great partnership with SACOG in doing this work, and that involves, aligning across priorities. We partner with SACOG and others for the prosperity strategy. So really looking at how broadband factors into our inclusive economic development strategy across the region. And Valley Vision is doing a lot of really broad ranging work to help ensure that not only is there broadband access in the region, but there's also access for families and households to technology, and also access to the digital skills that people need to be able to really be digital citizens in our region and navigate work and education and civic life through access to broadband. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but I will just point your attention to this, particularly this orange cover right here, this Getting Connected guide. This is going to be a major focus of what we're talking to you about today. So this is really a resource guide developed for local and regional government leaders to really look at what are some best practices around deploying broadband in your community. So that's going to be the main focus of our region. And beyond that, because we're short on time, I'll just note that we have a couple other new products out that are really oriented towards broadband access and digital inclusion. And I would invite you to go to our website and check those out. So one role that we play at Valley Vision is that we are the managers of the Connected California or Connected Capital Area Broadband Consortium. These are designated regions across the state that are really tasked with connecting unserved households to broadband, as well as working kind of across all the different entities to align and advance broadband access. So that includes internet service providers, it includes the California Public Utilities Commission, and then it includes local government and other community partners to make sure that we're all moving forward to hit this goal of connecting our target of at least 98% of households in our region to broadband, improving connectivity, particularly in rural areas, but also just really seeing this as a key issue related to social equity in our region and the ability to, like I said, to be full digital citizens here in the region. I'll note that that our work covers 4 counties, and that's Sacramento, Sutter, Yolo, and Yuba. But we work very closely with the consortia that manages El Dorado and Placer County. That includes a lot of data sharing and a lot of strategic alignment to make sure that as that whole 6-county region, that we're both well informed and well aligned with each other as we move forward for these goals. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a quick snapshot of what our broadband access looks like across the region. And this is, again, across the 4-county region. So the first thing I will just direct you to on this map is the red and yellow. So the red and yellow on this map really shows areas where there is little to no functional broadband service. So you'll see this across the rural areas of our region, and even some places around small communities across the region. And so that's where we're really not meeting any broadband standards when we don't have any service. If you look to the green, kind of that light green, that's the California standard. That's the existing standard right now, which is 6 megabits per second down and 1 megabits per second up of upload speeds. That is a really slow speed. So when you think about everything that everyone's trying to do on the internet in our modern world, that includes what we're doing right now, but even having multiple people on the internet at once. So think of students going to school or parents trying to work. That California standard speed really doesn't cover that need. And so if you look at that light green across our region, you see pretty extensive areas where we're really not meeting an adequate standard for the modern uses of broadband right now. So the California standards is below the FCC standard. It's you know, not all, most states are meeting the FCC standards. California is one that does not. So the FCC standards is in that light blue. That's the current standard that we're targeting right now. And you can see, you know, across the region, we're getting better connectivity and better reach with the FCC standard, but it's important to note, you know, broadband, we're not getting slower. We don't have less need, we have more need, and we have more people on our services. And so looking at that dark blue, we've got the California state plan. This is the speed that's been identified in our California Broadband for All Action Plan. So this is kind of the new and upcoming speed. This is the new standard that we're really aspiring to. So when you look at this dark blue area, you're really looking around urban areas for the most part in our region, and not much coverage out in the outside of those urban areas or in some of the further reaches of our county. And then finally, you see the gray, which is really the gold standard, really high speed there. That again is mostly in our urban areas. And so looking all in all, we have over 20,000 households across our 4-county areas, region that is not meeting the FCC standard, and over 40,000 that are not meeting the California state plan standard. So we have quite a bit of work to do when we think of increasing broadband coverage across our region. And just very quickly to kind of look at the range of cost that this entails. So we've quantified the number of unserved households in each county. And then we've looked at how much would it cost to meet the needs of those households and connect them. And so the second column there, that is fiber to household 100%, that's if we were to build out with kind of hardline infrastructure across our whole region, what would that cost? And that's, you can see for the 4-county area, that's about $250 million. Knowing that that's probably not possible in a lot of our rural areas, the final column is looking at if you did about half of fiber and about half of fixed wireless. So this is maybe a more affordable or realistic solution. Then we're looking at about $138 million for our 4-county region. And you can see we've added below the El Dorado and Placer. So that's that adds both households and costs. If you're thinking about our whole 6-county region, with a grand total of about $260 million to $475 million in cost for our unserved households. And then I think this is the last slide I'm going to share with you. Then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Trish Kelly, to talk about what we do about it as local governments and what are some tools that we might have at our disposal. But this is really thinking about broadband as a really necessary resource for businesses, and really looking at kind of the economic development side of broadband and how important it is. So if you look across this map, you can see kind of those hashed census areas that are either kind of brownish or kind of blue. And both of those are showing where we have businesses being served by broadband to some degree, with the more brown hashtag being hash marks being the faster speed. And you can see, again, we're very concentrated across our urban areas. And when you look at that light green and yellow, that's really showing areas where businesses are not being served by broadband. And the yellow particularly shows where we have business buildings and facilities. So what that really shows is quite a lot of opportunity across our region to connect businesses, and quite a lot of economic opportunity that's not being realized right now by businesses that are either underserved or unserved for broadband service. So with that, we're going to really focus in on what do we do about it. And I'm going to turn it over to Trish Kelly to talk about our resource guide.
Thank you very much, Evan. So time is short. So what I'm going to do is just show you what's in the guide. And then we are very happy to work with our colleagues. We work closely with SACOG on these issues all the time, but with you as members. So I want to first of all acknowledge that we developed this in partnership with the California Emerging Technology Fund, which is a statewide foundation that funds a lot of support for the regions. And we did an event last fall with SACOG when we were getting the guide ready. And I want to thank Director Stalin for being part of the group of local elected officials with joining us with SACOG last fall. So we've been updating this guide, which is a practical resource for local officials. It does include MPOs as well as local government. So next slide, please, Evan. So first of all, the report just goes over the roles that local government officials do play in the broadband sphere and why it's very important to address the issues which we all know. And we really see broadband as a green strategy as well as an equity and inclusion strategy as well, helping reduce vehicle mile travels, among other things. The next slide, please. So this is in the front of the report, it tells you how to use the guide. It has a lot of examples of practices, case studies, policies and ordinances, sample policies and ordinances. So you can go to look at jurisdictions across the state for similar kind of things. We have some good examples in our region as well. We also have a list of rich resources from state and federal organizations that really try to provide a lot of background information and again, case studies and resources for local government adoption. Next slide, please. So this is a very fast evolving field, as Christina and the consultants mentioned, and we have a quick slide on the funding that's just pouring into this area after years of being under-resourced. And so one thing we want to do is just note also that this work is technology neutral. So there's tons of innovation happening, which really makes it relevant for your committee. But these are the kind of examples that we have in the report: broadband master plans, which are really comprehensive strategies that look at your policies and sometimes do feasibility and funding strategies, what your assets are, and really lay out a path forward. And El Dorado County has just finished a long 5-year process that's leading into some federal funding for projects. Next slide, please. This is a big area of focus that's particularly relevant for our partnerships with our transportation agencies, and that's the Dig Once, Dig Smart policies, where we look at joint use projects for linking transportation and broadband with the placement of fiber and conduit. And it can also benefit your projects in terms of intelligent transportation systems and other capabilities to reach unserved or underserved communities. So breaking down the market barriers also to get new projects in the ground. Next slide, please. Municipal fiber to the premise is a big area of focus right now. So looking at the various ways that local governments can partner with providers to do projects that allow better control of local governments, because a lot of times the telecom providers just don't do the projects when we have a need and we've documented the market opportunity. Next slide, please. Another approach is a master license agreement, where you work with a provider or an infrastructure builder to leverage your assets for revenue and be able to get infrastructure projects in the ground. So this is a lot of how you would do those kind of licenses and terms. Next slide, please. So this is an example of the various kinds of models and case studies that we have. We have a lot of focus on practical assets that you can use. And then we have sample broadband access resolutions that other MPOs have adopted, and policies to bring broadband to underserved communities. And also a lot of this focuses on how we can look at 5G deployment, but more broadly, how we connect all the communities across our region. Next slide, please. So this MPO initiatives, James and the team is very familiar with the things that are going on in other areas. One thing that's particularly noteworthy in Southern California is working with providers to see if there could be a common shared ordinance across jurisdictions, because broadband is often a regional asset. So it could help, again, accelerate investment and communicate to providers that we're willing and ready to work with them. Next slide, please. These are the examples of some of the initiatives that have occurred throughout our region. They're included in the guide, but we also want to note that there are many, we know that many of you have local policies and ordinances as well. So there's could be something for community dialogue with your committee. And next slide, please. And I did, it's not included there, but the city of Placerville is also doing something that's really innovative. So for us, we're coordinating with the State Broadband Council and the state agencies, including Caltrans, on the implementation of the State Broadband for All Action Plan. We coordinate with Christina on tracking state and federal legislation, including there's a governor allocated new $7 billion broadband investment. The challenge with that is the legislature wants to do it over 7 years. A lot of us would prefer a much faster deployment. That's just to meet the identified unserved households across the state. We have far more needs. And then we're supporting local governments in our region to identify broadband priorities for local recovery strategies, coordinating with SACOG and Caltrans on joint use projects. Caltrans has a designated broadband coordinator. So that's really a great help for Caltrans to streamline their permitting. And then we're working with providers to increase investments in the region. So next slide, please. Our question, oh, this is just a quick example of what came out in the Brookings Institute last week. This is just the ARP funding resources. You can see there's a lot of funding coming in, not just for infrastructure. Yes.
We're going to have to wrap.
Okay.
Yeah, unfortunately,
Okay.
I apologize.
No problem. Here's the questions to you. We are ready to be a resource for you. So please let us know how we can help.
Thank you so much. And again, I
You're welcome.
apologize for having to cut that short.
No problem.
I think we had about at least three different topics today that could have maybe gone the whole meeting. Maybe some lunchtime breakouts that we've done on other issues. But James and Eric, certainly I think there could be more conversations on a lot of these. But with our last few minutes, we did. Was there any public comments on item 9?
No public comment.
Okay, great. Thank you, Robert. So item 10, and we'll just have a couple of minutes here, and we'll get you all on your way. And that was a race equity, the REI working group meeting report out. And I believe Monica has this one.
I think Chair Saragosa, I'm gonna take it.
Gotcha. And I
may call on Monica for help here. So
sure.
The staff, as you know, has done a lot of great work to set that the REI working group up for May 28th. So per the materials in your packet, the first meeting this year of the Race Equity Inclusion Working Group happened Friday, May 28th. As a reminder to everybody, especially those new board members, again, last year after the killing of George Floyd, then Chair Ferrix and Vice Chair Samayoa issued a statement, formed a Race Equity Inclusion Working Group last year. They really wanted to ask the question, what are the current systemic and institutional forms of racism in our region? How do we commit to tackling racial injustice and racial inequities and reducing racial disparities? And what is SACOG's role in those? And I would remind all of us again that I think we, as you've heard, I hope this year so far, we need to look no further really than transportation and housing to know that we've got a lot of work to do. We did an audit and the staff developed a racial equity framework last year. This year, with the turnover of the board, we have new board leadership, and the REI working group is chaired by Director Jennings and with Vice Chair Lucas Frericks. We have 3 outcomes this year. The outcomes are adopting a statement of commitment around racial equity that we want the board to take up by the end of the calendar year, moving towards a racial equity action plan that's specific and tangible, that will probably lead into the beginning of next year, 2022. And last but not least, really incorporating racial equity in a upcoming long-range plan, the Metropolitan Transportation Plan and Sustainable Community Strategy. Really recommend all the materials that were put together by staff that were given to the REI working group members, especially the 20-minute video that will harken back to the board workshop that you heard from Stephen Menendian earlier this year, based on an excellent book called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, which if you haven't read it, we really encourage you to do so. Director Jennings will be coming to the full board and doing a much much deeper report out at the full board meeting, but we just wanted, this is the committee to be reporting out to. So wanted to give you that update in his absence today, but also want to recognize Chair Saragosa, along with yourself, Director Middleton, Director Gog, were all present at the meeting. So, and I just, again, I want to thank staff. I know we had only a few minutes here, but your SACOG staff really put a lot of work into that meeting, curated a great agenda, some excellent materials, and a lot of work ahead, and it was a great meeting, and I'd like to get your reactions. It was a great first meeting, a lot of getting to know you, laying the foundation, setting the table. We have 10 public members, absolutely excellent, top-notch people who are joining 10 board members. So it's a 20-member working group. I think those external perspectives are going to be critical and really important, and the hard work is still ahead. Thanks.
Thank you, James, and thanks for doing the recap. And I agree. I thought I was dubious at first about sort of the really long introductions from 10 board members and 10 outside board members. But I have to say it actually worked perfectly, and I'm glad we allowed the time to do it, because we really got a chance to understand each other, where people were coming from, their backgrounds, and just sort of their, how they were going to approach, I think, the work of this committee. And I think that was beneficial to everybody that was going to be involved. So those were my initial impressions. And I thought the time was well worth it, to spend that good hour just getting to know each other a little bit better. I don't know if directors Gog or Middleton had any comments as well.
I actually really enjoyed the whole process, and I'm looking forward to the amount of work we're going to be, doing on this committee. It's really exciting, and I'm hopeful that we'll have some really strong outcomes to share with the rest of the board.
Thank you, Portia. Director Gog.
Thank you, sir. Learning a lot going through this committee. There's a lot of things that I realized in the time, but I did not understand them. But being a part of this group has broadened my knowledge and has made me think totally differently, trying to understand our problem. And I'm really thankful for having the opportunity to serve on this group. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Gog. And I think that should about wrap us up for today. And again, if you I know we sort of ran through a few of these quite quickly, so please follow up with staff or myself if you have further questions. Yes, Director Stollard.
Well, that was a goodbye wave.
Okay.
Thank you for a great meeting, everybody.
All right. Well, thanks again, everybody. We got you out of here a minute early still. So our next meeting will be August the 9th, and I will see the rest of you at our board of directors meetings next week. So thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Take care.